Yes, please start. आप full screen में पहले
I
रखे?
think you
Yes,
have got
now.
it in full screen. Okay.
Yes, yes.
Can we begin or should we wait?
Yes. You start the session, please.
So good morning to everybody again. It's a pleasure to meet you all through the IGNO course once more. So today our topic is actually concept of ecosystem. We have been looking at different other aspects of sustainability, but this is a very, very important thing for discussion today because this topic is very, at a conceptual level, it helps us realize how ecosystem and sustainability all form a big part of the narrative that we have been talking about. So just moving on, today we are actually going to begin with understanding what is an ecosystem. We will be discussing about the types, structures, functions, roles, and the needs for ecosystem through our class today. I'm going to start with this particular slide. So if you see here, the evolution of thought of ecosystem itself is a very, very interesting discussion because now we have a predefined idea of what ecosystem is. But what was it earlier like? How did the concept of ecosystem itself come into being? So as in the case of many other science and scientific discoveries, it came through a long process of evolution of thoughts, theoretical frameworks, as well as practical observational data, right? So if we can trace the history of the concept being coined through different milestones in history. One milestone I would say is when Stephen Forbes, he is actually, he studied lake as a microcosm. So what is a microcosm was not known then. This is a very, very classical paper of Stephen Forbes. He was actually observing a lake, and while observing the lake at an early time, 1887, if you will see, he said that it is a microcosm. That means it is a small representation of a larger system. Okay, so in a very simplistic term, this was what it meant. Through this lake, he saw the lake as an organism itself, where there were a system of organic interactions by which they influence and control each other. So it's a very interesting concept if you'll see. Before, at about the same time, another ecologist, Carl Mobius, in 1887, he actually advanced the theory of what was known as biocenosis and biotopes. So biocenosis means actually a community of organisms living together, which have adapted to their lives together. Okay, so that he coined as biocenosis. And biotope is the region of uniform environmental conditions, which are actually helping these organisms live, reproduce, and survive. So basically exist. It is, you can call a habitat, but of a region, right? So a regional level, regional scale. So these two terms were already there in use, but what we see in Stephen Forbes' vision of an ecosystem is somewhat different. He said that, see, we have organisms there and we have the physical environment, but these two are actually functioning together in such a way that they are like an organism themselves. So he called the lake an organism, which is a very interesting thought. So is an organism different from the concept of ecosystem? Okay, so this is what is going to reverberate through our session today. We are going to try to understand this in many different ways. Now, as we go down in history, 1920 to 1935, there were a lot of ideas put forth by another very important person, an ecologist, Tansley. He is a British ecologist. He said, and I think I should quote here, "Nevertheless, it is clear, even to the most superficial observer, that the complex of interactions between plants and their environment does lead to a certain degree of order in the arrangement and characters of the resulting vegetations." So now it's not just about the existential part that Forbes described. It is also about the evolutionary part, or how the feedback happened or the interaction happened between these organisms. And he was observing the plant environment, and with that observation, he says that a certain degree of organization or arrangement came forth, right? So this Because of this arrangement, something else evolved both on the interactive biological versus physical scale, which resulted in the vegetation cover that he observed at that point in time. So what he says now is that there is an interaction between the biological component and the physicochemical component. Another very important idea put forth in 1925, which sort of consolidated the idea of ecosystem itself, is by the physical chemist Lotka. What he said, and I quote, is the organic and inorganic worlds function as a single system to such an extent that it is impossible to understand either part without understanding the whole. So this sort of integrates and synthesizes the visions that was in existence about what is a concept of ecosystem through history. And when we come to the 1925 definition, we can very well actually identify with this discussion, because it makes sense to us now that we know through the advancement in science, we can understand that organic and inorganic worlds function as a single system. But it was not in the times of Mobius, because the term biocenosis and biotope is no longer actually accepted in the 21st century ecologists' purview or perspective, because it does not have this integration that is described later on. Right. So this interaction, what do you call this interaction of the biotic communities with the non-biotic communities? This is what was the very basic and the fundamental concept of what an ecosystem is about. So now we know that an ecological system or an ecosystem is any unit, in quotes, a biosystem, that includes all the organisms, that is the biotic community, in a given area, interacting with the physical environment so that there is a flow of energy leading to clearly defined biotic structures and cycling of materials between the living and the non-living parts. So herein comes another improvement in our understanding of what an ecosystem is. It is not just about the interactions, but how these interactions are facilitated. And that is through the flow of energy also. Okay, so there's a non-biotic component, whereas what we call as the materials or the nutrients, and there is another part which is called the energy. Okay, so the energy interacting with the materials, which the biota use, evolve, and impact themselves. So a system which facilitates these interactions is called an ecosystem. So ecosystem is more than just a geographical unit, we will agree, because it is a functional unit with inputs, outputs, and boundaries that can be either natural or arbitrary. So natural means it is always there, it has always been in existence, which the organisms have taken cognizance of, have adapted to, have survived within these boundaries. And arbitrary, wherever there are temporary boundary conditions which are set either by natural or anthropogenic means. Also mostly through the anthropogenic impacts, the arbitrary boundary for an ecosystem has also evolved over time. So this actually, the concept is when we think about ecosystem, the concept seems simple to us, but it is also complex in a sense. So let us make sense of both the subtlety and the complexity of the concept of ecosystem. Why it is simple and subtle? Because at a very fundamental and a basic level, we understand that life becomes operationalized. Okay, so this is a very simple way to say where life is in existence, where it is operating. That is at an ecosystem level. I'm not talking about the cellular level, because the discussion that I want to take you forth is through all scales. I'm coming to that, but you can also think a cell itself as an ecosystem in one way, right? So at a very basic level, life becomes operationalized. Then the pathways are established for these operations to go on. So that is another very simple characteristic that we have picked up from our discussion till now about what an ecosystem is about. But we have to understand that the complexity sets in when we think about those pathways themselves, because how these pathways happen. There are the starting points what are the feedbacks, what are the controls, and where are the edges. So when we think about these pathways, the complexity starts to set in quite rapidly. Herein, within a small ecosystem or a large ecosystem, we come across several pathways which merge together or diverge from each other, but still keep influencing different layers of activity within an ecosystem. We have to understand that. So there are different layers of activity. The ecosystem itself is not just a stable or a system which does not interact. It itself is interacting with other ecosystems, and there are inputs, there are outputs, so the dynamicity is constant. When the dynamicity is constant, both the internal dynamicity as well as external dynamicity, the pathways which set in bring more complex interactions in place. So this interconnectedness makes it difficult to understand how many ways of functioning does an ecosystem have. This is a very basic concept we have to understand. So herein, we have to talk about some states of ecosystem. Ecosystems can be in different state. One state is called a stable state. When it changes due to the impact of external forces, it comes to other states which are known as alternate states. So stable versus alternate states. This actually is pushed through the existing pathways which evolve themselves, the internal pathways which respond to the existing and evolving pathways from external forces. And this sets in what is known as an ecosystem state. See, in nature, every system tries to attain stability. This is our understanding. Every system tries to equilibrate or attain equilibrium. But not all systems are always stable or at equilibrium. So here, now we have to understand there can be stable states and there can be disturbed states. There can be, even within the disturbed states, we can call them as alternate states versus disturbed states, because alternate states are when there is an alternate equilibrium which has been set after deviating from the normal stable state. But when we say a disturbed state, that is still more dynamic in place, where the normal functioning of an ecosystem has not yet been resolved. Okay, complexity. Another complex, when we think about complexity of ecosystems, is by examining the multifacetedness of the ecosystem, because they are not catering to only one segment of biota, but rather a range of biota. And this range of biotic communities impact the ecosystem in different ways. So this multifacetedness is also a very key component when we discuss about the structure of an ecosystem, with the idea for preserving its services or sustainable development. Moving on, we are going to now simplify our understanding in different ways. So the concept of ecosystem, you can see on your left side, there is the physical structure that we call a biosphere, right? So the biosphere is the summation of all the biological communities which come together along with their physical units, which constitute what is known as biosphere. So a part of the biosphere is what we can say the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. But these more have a physical structure to it than the biological structure. For example, the atmosphere deals mostly with the air environment, hydrosphere with the water environment, and lithosphere with the soil environment. So an example shown here, okay, it shows how the pedosphere, which is placed within the lithosphere itself, can act as an ecosystem by itself. And on your right side, if you observe now, you can see that the biological structure of the pedosphere is very interesting. So we have several organisms which play different roles. Now, if we go back to our understanding of what Stephen Forbes thought about as a concept of ecosystem, it is very interesting, right? So if we consider this brown box that we see here as a cell, okay, our own cells, within the cells, we know we have chromosomes, we have the nucleus, we have the different cell organelles, and each of these organelles communicate with other organelles or other components of the cell, and together they actually act according to the their roles, because if it is the skin cell, the role of the skin cell is different from the role of a neuron rather. So each of these have specific functionalities, but they all are actually composites of different organelles. So here the cellular ecosystem itself is a good example of how we can look at an ecosystem. So if we are going to broaden our understanding to say this is not a cell, but it is a lake, right? So within the lake, we have organisms, and these organisms, as in the cell organelles, they interact with each other and they produce some output from this lake as a system. Similarly, let's come to the soil, which we are seeing here. It is now easy for us to understand that the soil have different types of flora, which are the vegetation, and fauna, or the animal population, right? Here you can see they have a complex food web going, where the interdependencies are between microorganisms and macroorganisms. So now when we see the plant residues, you can see bacteria, fungi, and mycorrhizae. The bacteria themselves feeding on the protozoa and the fungus feeding on the protozoa. So now there is a feeding, there is a predatorship. So protozoa feeding on this bacteria or fungi, they form a separate class by themselves. Then bacteria feeding nematodes and fungal feeding nematodes, they are a separate class. But each of them facilitate what is known as nutrient transfer between the different organism types, right? So here we know that the bacteria feeding nematodes contribute to the microarthropod population as well. These also similarly the nematodes. Okay, so within the speedosphere, the microarthropods, they actually interact or become the prey for the Enchytraedes and the macroarthropods, as well as the earthworms, right? So here the macrofauna, the mesofauna is the middle-sized organisms with the body size which is mid-sized. Macrofauna with large body sizes, and microfauna with small body sizes. So this micro, meso, macro, these together actually interact with the flora, which is a totally different community. So within a pedosphere, it is very evident. We see that the flora and the faunal assemblages interact with each other through what is known as the food web, each feeding the other, and each becoming a source for one specific function for this pedospheric ecosystem. What are the functions? We can see at the very microflora level, the function is to give organic matter turnover. So what is the basis from which this organic matter is generated at a microflora level? That is from the plant residues. And plant residues, the interactive part of the plants, that is the root, as well as the plant material or the debris which has fallen after the death of the plant, all this become actually the substratum. And from that substratum, organic matter is produced. So that is contributed to the pool of organic matter in the soil. Then if you see the next select class of the microfauna enable the churning of this organic matter, and they help in nutrient transfer. Okay, so then when we go to the mesofaunal level, there is actually, because of the cumulative effects of the production of organic matter through decomposition, then by nutrient transfer and churning, the soil structure itself is improved. There is an arrangement, there is an organization of the soil structure happening here. And this is exactly what we saw in the earlier definition. So here the soil structure improvement is one another function. So within the ecosystem, because of the interaction between the organisms with the abiotic components here, the abiotic components I'm going to come to, we are talking only about the biotic components. The soil structure itself is improved. So soil structure by itself is abiotic, but soil may be a living organism when there are other living organisms that it supports, right? So this is actually, as I said, a simple, a subtle, but a complex concept to understand, because the presence of biotic communities makes these functionalities happen, or the life becomes operationalized, as we say. When life becomes operationalized, it is not always favorable. There you can see that the mesofaunal, when we go towards the top levels, actually these are called the trophic levels, right? So when we go towards the top level, where the effect of the environment becomes higher, and here actually the disease transmission becomes higher, and so is the capacity to deal with this disease, which is also an intrinsic property which is generated through the interaction with the abiotic environment. So here we have the biotic and the abiotic interacting in a way to establish equilibrium. Let us take in the case of having a disease. Okay, so this disease is the organisms try to overcome the disease. The external forces try to consume the organisms. So there is always a feedback relationship in what is the number of organisms that can survive in a given per gram of a soil, or a given amount or quantity of soil. So there is always this interaction that is taking place. There's always a competition. There is always a sort of facilitating the feedback between the population versus the availability of resources and the resource usage. And finally, the microfaunal level, you can see there is also the the impact of higher organisms, such as pollution, which constantly cause degradation of the natural environment. So this is another scale of activity that an ecosystem is impacted by, and it responds to as well. So if we see now, a pedosphere, which is part of the biosphere, actually takes part in certain pathways. So the pathways are, first pathway as we saw is the food web. Another important pathway you can see in geological scale is the rock weathering, or the elemental uptake from this rock weathering. So these two are you can see synchronized activities which take place at different scales. So geologically, if we look at the pedosphere as a lithospheric unit, then we can understand that these pathways are more geological in nature. But let us see, if we look at it from an atmospheric point of view, the interaction between the pedosphere and the atmosphere, the pathways or the processes include processes such as photosynthesis by the plants which are above ground, but utilizing this particular pedospheric unit. Then we can have, bacteria and the mycorrhizae. So there is respiration, there is photosynthesis. This is one set of biological processes. Another set of abiotic processes, if you see, precipitation and evaporation. So these are actually climatic in nature. They are not, you cannot tell that they are geological, but they are climatic. Another way of interaction of the pedosphere with the hydrosphere, if we say, that will include, how the water seeps in through the pedosphere, where the water fills the soil pores, and what happens at the interface between the soil particles with the water. So there are different pathways that take place even there. On the whole, if we see the hydrospheric processes such as runoff, seepage, groundwater recharge, this will have an impact on how a pedospheric unit functions as an ecosystem itself, and how the nutrient transfer is facilitated because of the motion of these water through the soil itself. So here, soil, water, and evaporation, they form very specific pathways through which nutrient absorption and availability are increased to the biotic communities. So now if we see, there are different perspectives to how we can actually conceptualize the processes and the functionality of an ecosystem. Basically, from an individual level, we move on to what are groups of organisms living together. This group of organisms form communities of organisms which have through time adjusted to lives together, as you can see in this particular example that we saw. So the communities must have a suitable habitat for them to live, function, and reproduce. So this habitat or the biotope, they together are actually influenced by climatic factors, the geographical factors, as well as the internal biotic factors, such as the genetics themselves. So these together give rise to what are known as specific biomes. So biomes are also referred to as ecosystem types. So the typology of ecosystem here that we are looking at comes in the form of what biomes we have. We have rainforest, we have temperate tropical forests. So these are temperate forests, tropical forests, rainforests, evergreen forests. These are all specific biomes, and these are all specific ecosystem types which are present on the earth. The collection of all these biomes together constitute our biosphere, along with, of course, the physical processes that we are aware of. So the concept of ecosystem itself, if we see, is very, very interesting in this sense, because now we, starting from the unit or the perception of system type of perception of ecosystem, we are also touching upon what is the typology of ecosystems. So then now we understanding ecosystem means there are different dimensions for us to perceive. Pickett and Cadenasso in 2002, this is a very, very important publication that I have come across. They actually synthesize this very, very well. And they say that there are three basic dimensions for an ecosystem, which they classify under three different heads: meaning, model, and metaphor. So they say the first dimension when we look at an ecosystem is understanding what is an ecosystem and what is the core idea of an ecosystem that we have been looking at till now. Then we also have looked at how they are built and how do they work. So each ecosystem here, we should say, are different. So the first, when you see the meaning, it seems like a subtle and a simple concept. But with the pathways and the complexities that we just discussed, we understand that we have to model these processes, model how the ecosystem functions, what are the system components, and how these components function internally and externally, also in reference to the internal and external stimuli. So here, the modeling part of an ecosystem, how they are built and how they work, they are very important dimensions for us to understand if we have to understand what an ecosystem is. Finally, they say, through this, now we have understood the complex and the subtleties of the ecosystem. So where does this lead to? This leads us to understand what are these services as a unit. So ecosystem as a unit, what is its service? What does it do? And how they are valuable? This last question is very important to us from the sustainability point of view. So if you get a chance, I would advise and suggest that this particular landmark paper should be read completely. So that gives a whole new dimension or concept of what an ecosystem is about. Now, I have tried to put in many things together in this slide for a discussion, more comprehensive discussion. If we see this from the component wise, so we saw the meaning part of the meaning dimension of ecosystem, looking at the model dimension. When we go back to Tansley's definition again, it emphasized on the connections between the biotic and the abiotic components of ecosystem, if you will recall. So now that a term from physics is used to describe these interactions between biotic and abiotic, which highlight these interactions to a level which is more organic and also a more deeper concept, if you will understand. So that gives rise to what are known as hallmarks of ecosystem. What are the hallmarks of ecosystem? What do we call an ecosystem? Now, these days, we have a lot of the specialized terminologies which are used to, mention certain functional units. For example, a business environment, okay? A business environment and a business ecosystem, right? A startup ecosystem, examples. So are these all actually ecosystems? From the natural sciences perspective, I would say no, because ecosystem means it has two hallmarks. One is that it should have biodiversity, and second is physical infrastructure and environment. Now you can argue that a business ecosystem is not just about the business or the materials, it's about human beings as well, right? Then I would say go back to our previous definitions of what an ecosystem is. We have to have assemblages or communities of different organisms, plants and animals together, which have evolved to function together and also to shape the structure of an ecosystem. So from natural terms, a natural ecosystem should have biodiversity. So it's not just having biotic community, as we have seen earlier from Tansley's definition. This is we are scaling up our understanding of the concept of ecosystem by understanding that biodiversity concept is very, very critical to understand the concept of ecosystem, as also the physical infrastructure and the environmental boundaries, which actually put these biodiversity together as functional groups. So biodiversity includes, as you know, the biotic communities as well as the human beings, and the physical environment, which we have been talking about abiotic, which means the factors which are not consistent with a living or a life, right? They are actually physical processes or a chemical processes. So these factors like temperature, pressure, pH, salinity, solids, salts, macronutrients, micronutrients, climate. So these are all common to different hydrosphere, atmosphere, or lithosphere, the different realms of Earth. So here the abiotic components influence the biotic components in different ways, and this gives rise to biodiversity and also sustains it. So now we know to sustain, we need materials in form of nutrients, we need energy, which facilitates their mixing with the biotic components. By this process, we come out to what are known as materials and energy also in different forms. So input, there is material, and output, there is material. Input, there is energy, and there is output energy. So here we see what is called a nested hierarchy structure. So that is what an ecosystem is about. Each component is nested within itself in terms of material usage, energy usage, and interactions with particular communities and factors, other factors. So here, when we move on, again, I'm going back to the soil food web for an example. Initially, I spoke about what are known as trophic levels. Now I'm going to talk about them in detail. So this form a very integral component of an ecosystem. Here we have actually bacteria, fungi. You can see on your left-hand side, bacteria, fungi at a lower rung. We have carnivores, we have herbivores, we have green plants and the sun. Okay, so if you consider this structure, the bacteria and fungi form a part or level of the food web, which is, or the trophic level, which is known as the decomposers level. So they facilitate breaking down of the most minimalistic matter into the elemental fraction, right? So here they are the decomposers. Next, we have what are known as primary producers. So primary producers, you can see, are the plants which harness the sun, solar energy, and they harness the nutrients which the decomposers have given back to the environment. And through this, they produce actually what are known as food. Okay, food, or actually we can call storages, carbon storages for the next higher trophic level, by themselves storing that in their own material. So the primary consumers or the herbivores, they feed on these primary producers, and they actually successively cycle the nutrient to the next level, which is stored in their body. Okay, so the nutrients which are trapped in their body is consumed by the secondary consumers, which are larger organisms. There is always a size differentiation as we move higher and higher in the the trophic levels. Secondary consumers become the food for the tertiary consumers, and so on, quaternary. So here we see that there is even within the consumers, we have differentiation between the primary and the secondary, right? So there is a change here from autotrophy to heterotrophy, from the producer to the consumer level. And within the consumer level, within the heterotrophs itself, Heterotrophs are those which cannot make their own food. They are dependent on other organisms for their food. So this we know from our very school level definitions, and we are very cognizant of this. But what we have to understand is that this structure is not, parallel or synchronous or individual. It is actually a collection of, a different part of a collection of different types of food webs which are operating within a given space. So here you can see on your right hand side, there are other actually trophic level players. One you can see are what are known as pathogens and parasites, which again, as I mentioned, they cause disturbance. They are disturbance units because for one, they can be disturbance and they can be synchronous for the other. So another trophic level player are the grazers or the shredders, right? The fourth trophic level players can be higher level predators. Here you can see birds, arthropods, these are all higher level predators. And finally, which feed on the, rest of the trophic levels or specific to one trophic level below them. So here actually the number of players are magnified. If you see, starting from plants up to animals and birds, there is a magnification of biological communities which interact with each other. And to understand this as part of an ecosystem, we can take what are known as the top-down approach, that is going from the highest trophic level to the lower trophic level, how the energy is actually distributed. Or we can go a bottom-up approach from the producers up to the tertiary consumers or the highest level of consumers, where the energy level, is transmitted. So here actually we can see that material functioning is one aspect and energy transfer is higher aspect. But energy transfer is again contingent on the amount of food that is available. And this acts as a feedback mechanism by itself. So here ecosystem is such a dynamic feature. If we see that these feedback mechanisms need to be in place, it is not just interactions. We have to now identify ourselves with not having a generalistic term, but we are looking at the term called interactions in different perspective. It is actually feedback and it is actually progression together, right? So feedback and progression.
Madam, I have a question. At what level in this diagram is the pathogen created?
Pathogens are not created, they exist. That is the concept, right? So fungi, for example, or protists or protozoa, for example, they are present in any soil, right? But they can become parasites to another organism. So the level of interaction. Sorry.
Will be completion of this session. Okay, all the learners requested to keep, all your questions item set box in with you. Then we will have different discussion session. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So yes, so moving on, I was talking about how we are looking at these processes from a top-down or a bottom-up approach with different levels of nutrient and energy transfer as well as material and non-material interactions. So now we have to understand some other terminologies with respect to ecosystem, which makes these interactions clear to us. Now we look at this system as having some amount of what is known as standing stock, or it is defined as the amount of material which is in a given pool, such as you can attribute it to number of trees on the ground, or it can be the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere or the fishes in the ocean at a given time. So all these are standing stocks. Now, when I say standing stock, we should not confuse this, or we should not just say this only details about the biotic communities. No, it is also an inventory of all the abiotic factors also. That is why I have mentioned greenhouse gases there. Trees, greenhouse gases, fishes, birds. So what is the standing stock of fishes? What is the standing stock of birds in a given ecosystem? So those are standing stocks, or the amount of a material which is given in a pool. So we also associate the processes or pathways with what is known as mass balance. That is an indicator of how materials and energy change over time, but it emphasizes on the mass which is conserved per unit time. This is a very important consideration. Now, because we have already spoken about stable states, disturbed states, and alternate states, now this mass balance approach is very important way for us to perceive how the concept of ecosystem changes, right? So if we can say, for example, the mass balance has changed over time, we can actually, attribute it to what is the stable state and what are the alternate states. So this is a concept which details how the changes in materials and energy have taken place over time. Another way of looking at this is what is known as flux rates. It's not just another way, but it is a different perception and different quantification. So here what we are quantifying is actual amount of input and output quantities which change over time. This emphasizes on the change per unit time and not the mass conserved per unit time. So there is a slight difference, right? So flux rates means it indicates the dynamicity of an ecosystem. And then the residence time. When we say dynamic, then the next question that comes to us is what is retained? Okay, so retainment time, or the time for which a material, example, it can be nutrients or it can be gases, which are retained in the pool or the standing stock, is called the residence time. Here it is a ratio of the standing stock to the flux rate. So here the residence time can be different for different ecosystems. Now when we study, for example, we can take lake ecosystem, we can take pond ecosystem, a river ecosystem, and a coastal lagoon ecosystem. I'm going to talk about this in detail a little later, but now we have to understand that if you say a pond, okay, the changes in the residence time of nutrients in a pond can be different from that of a lake, just because the scale of operations are different. But both being standing water ecosystems, the residence time is definitely going to be higher when we consider or compare it with a river ecosystem. Here, because of the flowing water characteristics, flux rates are higher, residence times are lower mostly, unless there are other factors such as depth or some other factors which actually make the residence time to be higher for all the materials in a river ecosystem. Now, if we compare this with what is known as a coastal lagoon ecosystem, which is also connected to the sea, the dynamicity is more higher, but there is a differential residence level at different places within the ecosystem itself. So a coastal ecosystem themselves can be different, and they can be different from freshwater ecosystems in many different ways. So this, now we are actually, engaging our understanding of the concept of ecosystem into the dynamicity concept through understanding what are the standing stocks in an ecosystem and how they are conserved over time, or how they change over time, and how much of them is retained over time. Now we also have to understand that the force of feedbacks, as I already mentioned, can be of two types. It can be negative or positive. So negative feedbacks are those pathways which exert negative control on or delay the flow of materials, processes, and the transformational characteristic of the ecosystem itself. But positive feedbacks accelerate the ecosystem flows, facilitate the processes, linear flow of the processes, and also engage in or bring about the transformations for the ecosystem. So both are actually existent together within an ecosystem. So a complete unit of life will always have a standing stock on which there is a conservation happening, but which is actually used and impacted by the inflow and outflow of materials, which causes flux within the system. And through this flux, some portion of it is retained, some is actually, marketed out or deposited out. Understanding the perception of ecosystem through the processes perspective. Now, if we look at the concept of ecosystem from a scale perspective, we have to understand that ecosystems are usually scale independent. Okay, so it's actually very interesting to say this, because we understand that ecosystems must be scale dependent. Okay, we think in that way, but why they are scale independent is that they can be large or they can be small, but still they can function as a self-regulating unit by themselves. So that means that the scale is not the factor here, but the harmonious interactions of the organisms, the set of pathways. I will not even call it as harmonious, because there is also going to be negative feedback. The interactions, the feedbacks, and the organisms with the abiotic environment can be of different scale. They can be of a minute scale. Even if we consider a patch of soil, that is also an ecosystem. A droplet of water is an ecosystem. We can call this, when the elephants pass through soil, wet soil, they make small puddles of water. Even those are ecosystems, right? It's not just the bigger lakes or the bigger reservoirs or the ocean itself, but it is also the small systems also. They are also self-regulating units, but they should be self-regulating units. This is actually what we term as a ecosystem. So within a small or a large ecosystem, there can be microflora, macroflora and fauna, macrofauna, and there will be microfauna. There can be even nanopico sized fractions of organisms, as well as the chemical constituents, but they all have a specific and explicit bounded spatial extent. If we say spatial extent, the soil is a spatial extent. Okay, soil, when it does not actually dissipate into air like that, there is a boundary layer, right? So soil is different from water. Aquatic ecosystems are different from soil ecosystem. So that is the conceptual understanding that we come to. There is a boundary, there is a spatial boundary. And humans actually are part of multiple ecosystems in one sense. And it is not possible for humans alone to form an ecosystem, as we earlier spoke about, because the human ecosystem will tend to actually be weak if there were any such ecosystems itself. We will come to that perception a little later. But if we look at the perception of scale, we have to now understand and accept that ecosystems are scale independent. And within different scales, we can find different types of ecosystems themselves, which are functioning as self-regulating units. Now, here you see a photograph of a seagrass system. Okay, so this is actually a seagrass field, I would call, of Posidonia australis, which was recently discovered. It covers hundreds of square kilometers, and it is actually supposed to be just one organism covering entire hundreds of square kilometer. This actually was known to be the oldest possible organism which is in existence. Okay, so now by area in the world, it is the largest possible organism. How this can happen is that it is actually through a genetic process called polyploidy. Right, so each of these organisms have the same set of genetic material as the other. So every blade of grass you see is identical, which means that the whole system is just one organism. So can we call this an ecosystem? Right? So this is something very a philosophical way also of thinking how an organism can transcend what is the definition of an ecosystem. Can we call this an ecosystem? No, because an ecosystem happens only when this particular organism interacts with another community of organisms, namely fishes, right? We have water, we have the exchanges of nutrients and energy happening between the water and the other fishes and other type of marine organisms which interact with the sea grasses. So those complete together what are known as an ecosystem. So this clonal species itself cannot be considered, organism itself cannot be considered as an ecosystem by itself. But if the perspective that we have of different organs that we have in our body coming together to form us, to give us this identity, the interaction that we see between the different organ systems together with the energy that it produces for us to function as one particular organism, that can be called as an ecosystem, right? But the function, the major function is that there are actually boundary conditions again. Okay, so now if we have the boundary conditions explicitly defined, for example, in this is not explicitly defined. This whole organism that you see, it can multiply and multiply through hundreds and squares of kilometers, but it is just one organism. So the extent is about having this particular one organism and the extents between other organisms which occupy this particular habitat. So now we need to have habitats. We are one unit. We cannot be ecosystem because we are individual units. We occupy what is part of a habitat which we have adapted to using for our existence. So this now gives a clear idea what is an ecosystem and what is not an ecosystem. So now if we move on, we have to talk a little bit more about the equilibrium characteristics of an ecosystem. So now ecosystem by stability, there is actually several processes which make the ecosystem stable, and there are several processes which make it unstable. Now let us look at those which make it stable. When we look at stability of ecosystems, one particular aspect that we need to discuss is the conservative cycles. So conservation means, as we say, we already talked about mass balance. Whatever is remaining in the system is transformed from one state to another state, but it is retained within the system itself. So, for example, we have nutrients. So we are conserving the nutrients which are given there within a specified system boundary. So that contributes to stability of ecosystem. So for example, in the earlier seagrass example, when we saw the conservation of the nutrients in that sediment, that has caused the evolution of this polyploidy and actually the clonal species of these seagrasses to spread over a long period. So it has given the stability for existence of this particular seagrass species, Posidonia species. So here there are conservativeness. The concept of conservativeness or mass balance approach contributes to stability of ecosystems. Another process which is very difficult to understand in terms of stability, but it is also very important, is the evolutionary process. Okay, we can see evolutionary as a linear process, or we can see it as a cycle. Both are true. Both are in existence. So one phase leads to evolution of another phase, and that phase can de-evolve. So there are two pathways it can take. A becomes B, B becomes C. So B can also become A, right? So there is devolution also possible. So together in entirety, it actually leads to what is also known as conservation in one sense. So here now, this evolutionary processes also tend to stabilize an ecosystem. In the long run, it is not just the toughest or the fittest survive, but also those organisms which can adapt successfully to different external conditions or abiotic factors, they can also survive. So this is actually, it is not just a genetic process or an inherited trait, but it is also a survival trait through adaptation. So here now evolutionary processes leading to adaptation that also bring about stability of ecosystem. Finally, the very interaction between autotrophs and heterotrophs, although the nature of always the interactions is linear, right? So heterotrophs are always dependent on autotrophs for food, that is linear. This interaction changes populations. So through the change in population and the feedback control on population, the stability of ecosystems are always improved. Now let us look at the other side of it. What causes an ecosystem to be unstable. First is actually the processes themselves. Okay, they actually influence a mild change in the status of ecosystems. But for example, if we have, I'm going to talk about what is known as, the concept of nutrients a little bit more, but we have to understand that the energy and the nutrient processes, two different levels of processes, cause the dynamicity of the ecosystems, or it can make it unstable. One is the biogeochemistry of the ecosystem itself, biogeochemistry. It means the chemical interactions between the biospheric and the geospheric components together actually consolidate how materials move and how nutrients become biological materials, right? So nutrients are consumed, biological materials are produced, biological materials in turn transform the nutrients into alternate states. Those alternate states become the precursors of another transformation pathway for another biotic community, probably. This is one sphere of activity. Another sphere of activity is the chemical interaction between the chemical factors themselves. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, these are the essential components. We are going to talk about it pretty soon. So that, along with the energy transformations which are caused on a chemical front and carried over to a biochemical as well as a biological front, that together cause the dynamicity of ecosystems. But instability, or which those factors which make the ecosystem unstable, are the disturbance histories, right? So disturbance factors, for example, if we have forest fires, if there is precipitation, if there is a flood, so all these can change the way in which an ecosystem functions. Maybe its structure can be temporarily destroyed, but it can always come back because of the feedback loops that every ecosystem goes through. In that way, if we see the temporality of these processes, that is the fires, the precipitation, the floods, etc., as well as how the ecosystems go back to their stable states, this is a natural process by itself. This contributes to what is known as resilience of an ecosystem. That is, when an ecosystem is disturbed or it becomes unstable, how does it come back to the stable state or an alternate stable state? It may not come back to the ambient stable state, the same stable state it was, but it can go to an alternate stable state. So that actually is the core for us to understand how, if, for example, there is a degraded ecosystem, I'll also discuss this with an example, how it can go back to its previous state or an alternate stable state. So now we understand from a stability perspective that ecosystems have stability, but they are also dynamic on different scales, but they may not be restricted to equilibrium always. It can be stable, it can be dynamic, or it can even be unstable. So it all depends on the temporality of the processes. Now let us look at this diagram here. This is a structure of, say, a typical aquatic ecosystem. Okay, so an aquatic ecosystem, I hope that you are essentially trying to understand this as an aquatic ecosystem. But what is missing here is the description of the biotic components, right? So if we leave that and just see it as a structure from a structural component, there is a coupling between the physical and the chemical, but more important, between the physical chemical with the biological process of transformation. Now, when we look at the physico-chemical aspects in detail, we can see that the physical aspects alone can give structure to an ecosystem, such as, let us take the example of light penetration. The light and the penetration of oxygen from the atmosphere into the water, both are very important for survival of organisms in water, especially the top surface floating producer communities, as well as those at the bottom. So the light, the depth to which the light penetration is possible so that the producers are able to survive, that is known as the epilimnion. Then the extent or the depth an aquatic ecosystem, to which actually light penetration is not so saturated, but it is weakly available. Those are known as mesolimnion, and the bottom part is what is known as hypolimnion. Now we have to understand it is not just about the light, which is an abiotic factor. We are talking about abiotic factors here. We are also talking about dissolved oxygen concentration. In the hypolimnion layer, which is structured, the presence of oxygen is minimum. And in some cases, there is also formation of actually anoxic zones where oxygen is completely absent. So in a hypolimnion, it will be only minimum, but oxygen saturation will be absent, or oxygen itself is absent in anoxic zones. So these are also present in ecosystems. So what I am trying to let you know is, from a conceptual basis, we should understand that there are zonations which are formed by the interaction of abiotic factors themselves, through which organisms respond and survive and exist in. So if we see at the bottom of a lake where the oxygen is very less, there can be, we can assume that there will be no life forms. But that is not true, because even in the bottom of that area where there is no light penetration and there is very less oxygen or no oxygen, there are organisms which can use other nutrients for their survival and other gases for their survival, such as sulfur dioxide. So there are actually bacteria which can oxidize and which can utilize sulfur or sulfur dioxide for their survival. Right, sulfur dioxide, if it is formed, it is actually not an extreme environment, I would say. If there is no oxygenation that is happening, then it is the most extreme environment. Even in those extreme environments where hydrogen sulfide is formed, we still have bacteria which can survive in those depths. So here we see that also the mass balance approach, if we see the addition of materials, in this case, say water, and the removal of materials in this, say, another volume of water, that will also impact how the structure of these epilimnion, hypolimnion, monomolimnion, that is the zone which I mentioned where there is total absence of oxygen or anoxia. So all the structure get changed over time when the runoffs become different. Okay, so there also the volume changes due to natural processes such as evaporation, precipitation. These can also reduce or increase the volume through time. So, but the nature of these processes is that there is no considerable change in the water spread area over a significant amount of time. Only then can it survive and become a self-regulating unit. Now, we've seen from the biotic aspects, you will be able to actually appreciate how even from an abiotic perspective, it is most important that the structure or the self-regulating structure of the ecosystem has to evolve by itself. Now, imagine this is not a big lake, but a small drop of water. Okay, you can see that the dynamism in evaporation will be very high. It can survive for a day, maybe, okay, or a few hours or a few minutes. So that is the scale or the time scale or the temporality for survival of that particular ecosystem, a drop of water, when we consider it temporally. Okay, so here now you can see that a combination of processes, not from the biotic, not only from the biotic transformation perspective, but also from the abiotic factors such as the processes operating with respect to temperature, operating with respect to the chemistry and the physicality of the environment. Those are also very important to make ecosystems self-regulating. Now we have thought about both the scale and the temporality. Let us put this in terms of the composition, in terms of natural variability. So you can, in terms of natural variability, we can look at actually, when we considered actually the three dimensions of ecological ecosystem, we said meaning, model, and metaphor. Now the model component tells us that the system components of an ecosystem are different in our understanding from other systems we can try to characterize. How? Number one, the components are themselves non-linear. So you cannot say that, take a handful of nematodes and take a handful of bacteria, take a handful of microorganisms, put them together. You have the soil particles. You put this abiotic and biotic components together, and they will remain. It is not like that. They are non-linear, right? So there can be other organisms which come in to the ecosystem at some point of time, but they don't form a part of the stable ecosystem. They move out, but they can be part of other ecosystems. So there is always a chance that there is non-linearity in not just the the processes, but also in populations. So that makes it a case for natural variability. Ecosystems are dynamic and they are naturally variable, and the scale of this variability is also very different. And this actually can be represented by the number of variables that you use to describe an ecosystem, as well as the time scale in which we are investigating an ecosystem. So if we see at an ecosystem level, most are single problem, what are known as single problem models or single systems, right? Single problem means one single system. But the concept of ecosystem transcends even this, because there is an integration of multiple systems which constitute a bigger system. So when we see that at a regional scale, why we are studying this particular concept and trying to understand is that the integration of multiple systems brings in more complexity for what we want to achieve for our sustainable development of ecosystems. So when we are actually trying to conserve one ecosystem, it can be at the detriment of another ecosystem. We will not know unless we know how integrated they are. Also, there is a hierarchy in evolution of these ecosystems, which we have to address. So an ecosystem, like I said, cannot be a drop of water. It may be a bigger ecosystem like a lake. So our management for, say, a bigger ecosystem like a lake is going to be different from the management that we would think of to sustain a small drop of water as an ecosystem if we want to do. This is just an example I'm giving you. So now if we want to conserve, say, a lake ecosystem versus a river ecosystem, the concepts of sustainability through time and scale, through the feedback mechanism, through the processes, as well as the self-sustaining capacity or the resilience attributes for river and the lake will be different. So from a sustainability component, we have to think of the change that the ecosystems undergo in terms of space, time, and composition, along with the non-linear system of system components itself, as well as the feedback mechanisms. Even those are non-linear. You cannot say there will be just a linear pathway of chemical reactions happening, or there is a linear pathway that this organism will only feed on this organism. There can be times when the usual food is not available, so an organism tries to adopt some other new sources of food. So there can be a change, but the overall equilibrium of ecosystems remain. What is a lake remains a lake. What is a river remains a river. So that is the integrated or self-regulating aspect that ecosystems are undergoing. This actually sums all the discussion that we have had now, but it also links it to the concept of services as we saw. Now we are moving on to the metaphoric dimension that we are talking about. We saw about the biophysical structure. We understood that there is a functionality concerning each of these processes and the structure of ecosystems. And this results in what is known as service. That is, for example, the mangroves, if we take mangrove ecosystems, they offer what is known as flood protection. Okay. So they also offer some extra services in terms of mangrove wood products, right? So here, these are the service that these ecosystems offer. Apart from being in existence, being able to support life, they offer other additional services, and services we have discussed earlier in earlier class also, that they can be of different types: provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and other services. So this cultural service, in this context, human being is well placed to accept the cultural services of ecosystem. For example, they contribute to the health and safety of human beings. Also in a socio-cultural context, they are also giving economic value for their service. Okay, so the mangrove forest or the ecosystem does not produce or function in a way it thinks of monetary or economic benefit. It is the value addedness that human beings give to these services which makes it economically viable or economically significant. So here you see a term called willingness to pay or WTP for protection of these products so that they can be enjoyed sustainably by human beings over longer periods of time. That actually necessitates for us to look at the benefits versus services component, which necessitates us to look at what is basic core idea of an ecosystem and how that should not be destroyed to a certain extent so that the natural resilience is maintained. Up to that point, disturbance is allowed, but above that point, if it is disturbed, it cannot be brought back to the same native level. So herein comes the concept of environmental degradation, which is concerning how we use the service that ecosystems offer and have the benefits sustained over longer period of time. So here you can see, this is the framework which links the ecosystems, concept of ecosystems itself with human well-being. So without these services, we may not be actually well placed in our existence on this earth. So now we understand that ecosystems extend just beyond the biological, physical, and chemical boundaries. They are actually nexus of how humans and ecosystems interact with each other and how it binds us to the use of natural resources. So the core concept of sustainability is developed from understanding not just the physical structure and process and the functions of ecosystems, but also their services component. Now I'm going to also talk a little bit of how we can apply this for in actually understanding the conceptual part further. So the meaning part now to synthesize says complex assemblages of biota, chemical process and physical dynamics is influenced by environmental and human activities. Also, this should reflect on applicability of sustainable development through understanding the key aspects of distributions with reference to how the environmental and human activities are influencing each other. So the core characteristic of ecosystem, we are going back to the concept of biome here. The core understanding of biome and the core understanding of biodiversity, which means how species are distributed and how seasonally they respond to it, is very, very important. So embedded in the core concept of ecosystem is also understanding distributions and the seasonal responses. Now I'm going to take you through an example of a conservative way to understand the different concepts of ecosystem, that is scale, the composition, the feedback mechanisms, and the changes. Okay, so now we are standing at a place where we have a conceptual example from what is known as ecological stoichiometry, which means that there is a conservation of important nutrients on earth in terms of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. This was promoted by an oceanographer, Redfield, and it's named after him, called the Redfield ratios. So the classic, it is said that in any elemental state, in the basic or a stable state, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus will be present in the proportions of 106:16:1. So for every phosphorus, there will be 16 nitrogen. For every 16 nitrogen, there is 106 carbon. In another way, it can be for 106 carbon, 16 nitrogen, and 1 phosphorus are present, right? So the units of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus should be in this proportion for any stable stoichiometric process to occur in ecosystems. But through the development in science and through many observational and experimental work, they also found there can be what are known as limiting factors. So these are actually the concept of limiting factors is very important from the feedback perspective that we have been looking. So phosphorus itself, say it is not present as 1 unit per 106 unit, but it is present as 2 units or 3 units. Now it becomes limiting on how the carbon and nitrogen will be processed, right? So if in the presence of 1 unit of phosphorus, 106 units of carbon can be processed. But if 2 units are available, then you know that there is a differential rate at which carbon will be absorbed. So there is a difference if you see. Similar to phosphorus, there is also another important element, silicate or silicon, which comes into the picture. So it is present usually as a very weak acid in water. It is called siliceous acid. So the silicic acid or siliceous acid, as it is called, it is placed between actually carbon and nitrogen, which were actually found first to be the macronutrients, right? So the macronutrients here you can see silicate present in 106:15:16:1 forms one stable state. So this stable state can also be an alternative stable state if the composition of Si changes in time. So what if the Si becomes 1? Then the processing of material cannot happen in the same ratio as 106:15:16:1. It will decrease or increase, which means there is a limitation on the use of carbon when other limiting factors are present. So that is the central idea. Carbon is always utilized in an ecosystem. Carbon is taken up. It is part of the carbohydrates which is formed. It is part of the food. It is part of the substratum, and it is recycled back to its elemental state. So in the elemental state, from an elemental state to back to the elemental state, it has to be processed. If it has to be processed completely, then the ratios of other nutrients should be ideal. So the ideal ratios of N:2P, nitrogen is to phosphorus, if it is 16:1, or Si is to N:2P, 15:16:1, can facilitate the proper conversion or cycling of carbon through an ecosystem. This is the idealized stoichiometric ratio. Now, if you see again, there is another component coming in, which is called a limiting factor. Again, that is called ion, okay, Fe. You see, C is to Ns, N is to P is to Fe in the ratio 106:16:1 is to 0.1 to 1. Okay, that range. That can give an idealized way in which carbon is processed through ecosystem. But if it goes above 1, there is going to be a disproportion or disequilibrium or a loss in equilibrium, right? So here in 2000, Falkowski said the changes in the ratio of dissolved elements in water with specific reference to water will reflect that the chemistry of water has a biological basis. This is a very, very interesting advancement, which also parallels our understanding of what an ecosystem is. What it means is that if nitrogen is greater than phosphorus, say in water, phosphorus becomes limiting. If phosphorus is greater than nitrogen in its elemental state, nitrogen becomes limiting. For silicon limited systems, the implications are highest for some biotic communities than the others. In this case, let us take the example of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is a community of organisms which are producers living in water, right? They can be on the surface or they can be in the surface sediment. They can be actually what are known as algae. They're called as algae, which free float on the surface. They can also be some organisms which are present at the bottom of the lake. They are known as diatoms. Okay, they are not actually algae. They are another producer communities which have specialized body structure with a shell which is made of silicates. So if in silicate limited systems, the presence of diatoms or what are known as benthic forms, they are less. And the free floating forms are higher, which means there is going to be a change in the biological composition of that ecosystem itself. If the system itself is ion limited, there can be implication for algal production. That is, there is a change from autotrophic composition to a heterotrophic composition, or vice versa, when there is a limitation on ion. Okay. So now we also have to understand within ecosystems, as I already mentioned, the freshwater ecosystems tend to be phosphorus limited basically, and marine systems or coastal systems tend to be nitrogen limited. But there can always be exceptions, and these exceptions should be looked at as through the stability perspective that we earlier discussed about ecosystem. Has the ecosystem changed or evolved over time? So the contribution of these abiotic factors, one we saw from the structural aspect, and now we are seeing from the functional aspect. Structural aspect we saw from the physical processes, and the functional point of view from the chemical processes. Both have a biological basis through which they are formed and through which they will be degraded. So the self-regulating mechanism of ecosystem is another concept which is embedded through our understanding of these CNP ratios. Now, for example, if we have excess C or excess nitrogen compared to phosphorus, we are only discussing what if the phosphorus increase, what if the limiting nutrient increases. Then they are removed through respiration or denitrification. So here we can say if the respiration or denitrification rates are higher, as we will calculate from the structural point of view or the process point of view when we saw what are known as fluxes of gases through gases, for example, more of emission of CO2 rather. Okay, so there actually the excess element with gaseous phases are evident. This actually has a very practical control on the human community as well. As we know, climate change is one reality which is very much related to the ecological stoichiometry of ecosystems. So it's very clear to us. Another way is, say, if carbon or nitrogen is very deficit compared to phosphorus, then they are added through photosynthesis or fixed as nitrogen in the ecosystems. So here, then, if, for example, looking at only phosphorus, excuse me, which is the ultimate regulator of production over geological time periods. Why? Because the conservation of phosphorus is the most evident one. Phosphorus is not usually, cannot change state to gaseous state very easily. It is not that dynamic. It is present mostly in solid form, and it has been conserved over larger periods in time through geological time scale. So looking at phosphorus, we can trace what is the status of a particular ecosystem. Is it in stable state or is it in alternate state? So here it becomes what is known as a proxy. But the idea that we get about the concept of ecosystem again is that macro scale outcomes are evident through simple interaction among the micro scale components which form an ecosystem. So here through the CNP ratios, we are very well able to judge how the biological processes alter and get altered by the presence of chemical processes and their interaction between the chemical constituents themselves. So now, when we take this concept a little higher, as I told you, this reflects the CNP ratios reflect through the processes into the structural component, as you can divide a lake which has very low nutrient and very less primary production as an oligotrophic lake. So this is the classification of ecosystems part that we are looking at. On the other hand, there can be ecosystems which have moderate amount of these nutrients and give moderate primary production. So those are known as mesotrophic systems. And the eutrophic or hypertrophic systems where there is excess nutrients. We are all aware of the water bodies where it's fully green in color on top. So those are eutrophic systems. There is excess of production of algae and excess of nutrients available. Those are known as eutrophic or hypertrophic systems. So hypereutrophic and eutrophic conditions are on the one part or the extreme scale of activities that an ecosystem can produce through its internal processes. Again, macroscopic examination of microscopic processes that bring about these transformations. That is actually an indicator of the functionality or the total state of an ecosystem. Now we can see that there can be isolated systems. There can be systems where there is limited exchange with alternate ecosystems, like lakes with riverine ecosystem or a marine ecosystem. And there can be also part of a larger complex of ecosystems, such as the wetland complex, where there are marshlands, where there are mangroves, there are seagrasses, there are sand barrier islands. Each of them are typical self-regulating units themselves as ecosystems. So here we can see there will be horizontal gradients which act across these ecosystems, and there will be vertical gradients which trap the materials. So here they contribute to what is known as sequestration characteristics. In particular, carbon sequestration is something which is very, very core again to sustainability. So we have to understand that it is not just the system output or the ecosystem output or the ecosystem value or benefit. It is the integrated range of services offered by the ecosystems which are interacting together. Now the ecosystem dimensions, very interestingly, change over time as well. Why do they change? Because now in our parlance, we have been, describing a natural ecosystem, but we have actually created other ecosystems of our own, which we cannot, bring in with the concept or the initial understanding of an ecosystem concept. Because why I'm discussing this is that most discussions will stop with the structure and the concept of a natural ecosystem. But here we have evolved natural systems within the perspective of rural and urban. This is actually human transformation that has happened over time, which has altered the ecoscape on Earth. Here you can see that there are 5 different ways in which we are not able to actually relate to the original concept of ecosystem. Number 1, should we consider communities as organisms themselves? We have been discussing about this particular point a lot earlier, but if you think about a rural versus an urban scape, here the urban is basically humans versus the physical structures, whereas the rural have more of green or blue infrastructures and not just the gray structures that the cities have. In that case, the human communities are the only organisms inhabiting the urban environment, mostly, predominantly. So can we equate communities to organism level itself? That is one question which has led to a varied approach to what the concept of an ecosystem should be when it is attributed in the urban sense. So in that case, can we say, in an urban environment, man has tried to equilibrate everything so that man lives in harmony and does his work. So there are no disturbance regimes. Can we call this a stable community? No, it's definitely not, because we have to understand that evolving communities, the disease itself is a disturbance, as we have seen very lately. Pandemic is a big disturbance. It has affected the urban populations more than the rural populations. So the concept of ecosystem still holds in that sense. Now we cannot first call the urban communities or organisms as ecosystems themselves, first our understanding, and we cannot say that they are the stable communities. Also, we cannot say that the recovery or the resilience characteristic of an urban ecosystem is directional or linear, and it's also deterministic, that it is already known that there are specific pathways to achieve this resilience. It is not known. Pandemic again is a very good example for this. Finally, is the recovery gradual? For a natural ecosystem, it can take several ecological successions for it to come to a stable state, okay? And there can be changes to the ecosystem structure and function itself. So it is a very gradual process and very slow process. It can transform from one to another, and it can, take the forms of manifold functions of different forms of units, self-regulating units, to come to a stable position. But that does not happen in an urban environment. Is it gradual? We have to look at it again in terms of scales of activity. Now, if we see the succession, the scale, the deterministic attributes, the stable communities, and the community level, we can actually relate this to the concept of urban sustainability very, very well, because it actually mirrors the actual concept of ecosystem very well. We have to apply the same set of rules that we apply to the natural or the rural ecosystems to the urban ecosystem that we see. The only difference is the material flows and the energy flows which are used by human beings for different activities that should not lead to the degradation of other components of ecosystem. So that becomes our key note for achieving sustainable development. Because here you can see, for example, if we consider a lake in a rural setup and a lake in an urban setup, you can see the functionalities are standard, but there are actually more extra cultural services that lake offer in an urban environment. Apart from, natural services like reduced flood risk, carbon sequestration, improved air quality, the urban foraging, the foraging characteristics, shading and cooling characteristics, it is very well concerned also with actually what is known as being a socio-cultural space, okay, where social cohesion or coming together of different types of human communities together, where they get educated, they get culturally enriched, and their health and well-being is improved over time by reconnecting with the nature. These are actually the services, extra services that lakes provide in an urban environment. So here we can see that this concept of ecosystem is strengthened in that way. It is not diluted because there is no difference between basically our perspective of environment, even in an urban sense. So here you can say from a typical point of view, as we have been seeing, the distribution of water and nutrients which contribute to the production, the uptake through the hydrological cycles is also linked to what is known as pollution remediation. So this concept is also another core aspect which actually helps us to understand that, we have to understand the lake ecosystems here as reservoirs of precious commodities. Okay, so also improving the quality of this commodity and helping to normalize its natural services like carbon sequestration. This is very fundamental to the concept of an urban ecosystem. So these aspects, that is actually preserving the commodity, improving its quality, helping to restore its natural services, and also to enable the natural functionalities in place, that these four aspects are very, very important for connecting ecosystems to sustainability. Now we know that whenever there is a, this diagram is to actually reinforce what we have seen earlier, but in terms of the abiotic processes also, not just the biotic processes. Here we can see that when there is no rain, there is some, if we increase the amount of, impermeable spaces, there is more runoff somewhere and much less infiltration elsewhere, which will cause a sort of a mismatch. So this hydrological cycle, if there is a mismatch in the hydrological cycle, as it is happening in an urban water cycle, then the spatial and temporal factors will cause a more rapid scale of damage as well as more widespread scale of damage to the biotic and abiotic parts of the urban ecosystem also. So now we have to understand that the urban ecosystem is also scale independent in one sense, but it is dependent on the effects of the spatial and temporal factors and the intensity of the factors over a given period in time. So the processes of sustainability should also address the functionalities of ecosystem, which should not be lost, where with giving more, there can be alternate stable states that we can think about, but the functionality, the core functionality should not be lost. So here we can say that the reservoirs have to be maintained. That is one very important aspect. So including the phase transitions, we should understand that in an ecosystem, the phase transitions also highlight the way in which the commodity, say for example water, is moved across from river to ocean, from river to ocean, ocean to atmosphere, and atmosphere back as precipitation into the ground and infiltration. So this is actually an interconnected movement of water. This phase transition also enable the mass balance or conservation that we have seen. So from the examples we have seen now, we see that study of the aquatic ecosystems, for an example, is not very simple, although it is very subtle. It is also very complex interaction of sub-disciplines of understanding these interactions, which contribute majorly to inputs for sustainable development. You can see the different fields of research through STEM, science, technology, engineering, and management approach, which should integrate to help us to understand the ecosystem in a better way, how the behavior of these processes happen in real times, how the processes and feedback mechanisms influence the water ecosystems, and how human engineering will restrict or enhance the services delivery of these ecosystems. So I'm giving an example, a current example that we have been doing in our lab. We are actually trying to see what is the habitat suitability for seagrasses in coastal ecosystems in terms of what are the habitat changes. And we are determining what are the loops which actually reduce the resilience or increase the resilience, and how the transformation of these ecosystems at an ecosystem level can be achieved through disaster risk resilience approaches. So here it is important because seagrass themselves, their habitat is fragmented, as are the habitats of the organisms dependent on them, such as prawns, which actually depend on them for preservation in a microtidal habitat of their juveniles, which come from the sea. They stay in the seagrass environment, they reproduce and they leave. So when the seagrasses are lost, there will be a cumulative effect on the communities of the juveniles, as well as the next stock, the future stock of prawns which inhabit this region. So here we see that disturbance in one community will affect the population and dynamics in another community, as well as it will disturb the overall abiotic environment as such. So there is what is known as fragmentation that is happening. So we are trying to study whether the influence of anthropogenic factors or environmental factors or climate factors or their integrated aspects can lead to human habitat fragmentation, not human, sorry, habitat fragmentation at different levels. So how to get this back to the point where the seagrass beds nurture the economic values of these ecosystems, that is very important from a human perspective. So now coupling seagrasses with the ecosystem services is a good example of transformational space synthesis. So we are assuming that in the first step, the habitat has to be conserved, which actually starts with the assessment of the vulnerability status of these ecosystems itself. Moving on, we have to assess the capital of these ecosystems, especially with respect to components such as the seagrasses. What is their natural capital of each of these components? So going by the systems approach, we identify the processes which disturbs the stable states and does not result in alternate stable state, but results in a disturbed phase in short periods of time. So this accelerated disturbance factors should be constrained so that the landed values of the prawns, they can be improved. And for this approach, from a cultural point of view, we are actually trying to study from the knowledge bases based on the metrics, actually the data that is available on the quantity, the mass balance, the fluxes, the pathways, and the networking or the interactions between the seagrasses with the other organisms, which can help us to determine how the standing stock is maintained in natural terms and how it has changed over or evolved over a period of time. Here, the use of remote sensing and advanced techniques are also very, very helpful processes. So the socio-ecology of this whole space, this transformational space, is very important to understand the benefits that humans derive from these ecosystems. So now we understand, to summarize, that ecosystem perspectives helps us to understand the properties, statuses, and the challenges of the ecosystems, which we analyze through our system of understanding scientifically through geospatial, statistical, or the energy perspectives. And the needs for doing this study of ecosystems or understanding the concept of ecosystem is definitely towards better management of the ecosystem services and the resources, as well as their conservation and preservation for longer periods of time, which leads towards sustainable development of human societies as well. And here the valuation of ecosystem becomes a central concept. So with that, I stop today and I'll be happy to take questions from your end. Thank you for joining this class.